Hello everyone, welcome to the second part of the tutorial. So in this tutorial, we are going to look at how to animate layers that we exported from Photoshop in After Effects. So first of all, let's take a look at the layers that we have. Probably we would only need one of the three background layers, and I would not use the 00 or 01. I would start with 02 as the background, and then I would add the 03 render base, the 4 planting textures, 5 wayfinding elements, 6 people, and then finally color and light and color finishes onto the background number 2. And eventually I'm going to also just simply show how to animate text and text with leader lines in After Effects as well. So let's open After Effects. When you first open After Effects, you have this pop-up window, and we just need to click New Project. And then we are prompted into this main interface of After Effects. It looks kind of different than Photoshop or Illustrator, as that there's much more panels here. So at the very top of the interface, we have the toolbars. This is where you can find the selection tool, hand tool, zoom, rotate, camera, pen, pen tool, etc., etc. And then on the upper left corner, we have the project panel. This is where we can bring all the assets into After Effects and then animate them. In the middle, we have the composition panel. This is where we would preview the composition. And then on the upper right corner, we have the info and preset panel. I would actually encourage you guys to just try different effects and presets from this panel. They are pretty fun to play with. And at the bottom, we have the timeline. And currently, there's nothing here because we haven't brought in anything into this project. And to start, we will need to bring the layers into After Effects by simply drag and drop them into the project panel. I'll have them selected, drag and drop them here in the project panel. And then let's find the 02, which would be the background. We need to create a new composition by dragging the 02 background onto the composition icon at the bottom of the project panel, and then automatically you can see that this composition is created in the project panel with the exact same settings as the image. So you'll have the same resolution, and then the default is 15 seconds. And for this project, it's probably enough, but later I'm going to also show you how to change the timeline settings. And then we can bring all the other layers into the timeline as well, just like drag them into the timeline. And similar to Photoshop and Illustrator layers, whatever on top is going to be seen, and it's going to cover the layers below. So now we need to reorganize those layers so that the background is at the bottom, and then we have the render base, and then the planting textures, and then the wayfinding elements, people, and the light and color finishes would be at the topmost layer. And then we can move on to the timeline itself. And here I would like to organize roughly when those elements would show up in the composition. So to do so, we can simply just drag this color blocks in the timeline, and you can also just place your cursor at the beginning of the color block and then drag to extend or shorten this layer as well. So what I want to do is that I would want to keep the background for the whole duration of 15 seconds, but the render base would only show up at around 2 seconds, and then the planting texture I would only show up around 4 seconds, and then the wayfinding elements would be around 6 seconds, and then people would be around 8 seconds, and light and color finishes would be only showing up at around 10 seconds. And then we can drag this time indicator around and see how it's playing out. So for the first 2 seconds, it's just the background, and then we can see that render base is added at the 2-second mark, and then at 4 seconds, the next layer shows up, and then 6 seconds, the next layer shows up, etc. So now we would like to animate how these layers show up. So let's start from render base. For this layer, I want to give it a gentle fade in, which would be really simple to do. We can just expand this layer by clicking the arrow in front of the layer and then expand the transform. We can see there's few options we have here. One of them is opacity, and then in front of opacity there's a stopwatch icon. Once we click this icon, we are basically placing keyframes and then animate this option. So let's go to the start of this layer, so around 2-second mark. And then if you hold shift while dragging the time indicator, it will snap to the beginning or to the end of the clip or to the keyframes. So at the beginning of this layer, I would want to click on the stopwatch icon and put a keyframe here, and here I would like the opacity to be 0. And then a few keyframes in, I would like this opacity to be 100, so we just change the number here behind opacity, and it would automatically put a keyframe here once we change the value. And we can drag the time indicator across, and we can see in the composition panel that there is a fade-in effect for this layer. So now we can collapse this option and move to the planting texture layer. For this layer, I'm going to show how to add a preset effect. So the effect I want to add is linear wipe. So we just type linear wipe here. And before we apply this linear wipe preset, we want to move the time indicator to where we want this animation to start. And then we can drag the linear wipe preset and drop it onto this layer. And then you can see that there is an FX sign here, meaning that there's a special effect applied to this layer. And then if we go to the project panel, we can also see that this panel now becomes the effect controls panel. And then let's just drag the time indicator around and see what it did exactly. So now we have a vertical wipe, which is fine, but in this case, I would like it to be from top to bottom. So what we can change is the wipe angle. Let's just change it to 0. And immediately you see in the composition panel that the direction changed. And then I would also don't want this sharp edge. So we can change the feather. Let's make it 100. Yeah, now it looks much better. Let's just play it by hit the space bar. It seems a little bit slow. So let's see how long this animation actually is. What we can do is expand this layer by clicking the arrow in front, and then we see there's keyframes placed here. So this effect lasts a second, which I would say is a little bit too long. So I want to expand the effects and then expand linear wipe until I can see those diamond-shaped keyframes, which means that I can move them around, and then you can select them and then drag them forward. So this effect is much faster. Now we can collapse this layer and move on to the next layer. So for wayfinding elements, I actually want two effects onto this layer. One is slowly dropping down from above, and also it's also fading in. These two are pretty basic animations. Expand this layer and then expand transform. So for dropping down, it would be the position. And then for fading in, it will be the opacity. And now since this layer is already positioned at its final position, so let's animate this backward. So I would give it 6-7 frames and then place the time indicator here and click the stopwatch icon in front of opacity and in front of position. So we've animated the final positions and opacity of this animation, and then let's move on to the beginning. So I would want to animate this layer dropping down. So what we can do is just change the Z-axis of the position option just by a little bit, and you can preview it in the composition panel. And also at this point, I want the opacity to be 50%. And let's take a look at how it is by dragging the time indicator. Yeah, it looks pretty good. So what we can do, since we want the same effect for people, so we can select all these 4 keyframes and Ctrl+C to copy them, and select the 06 people layer and then place the time indicator to the beginning of this clip, and then Ctrl+V to copy those keyframes. And then now if we expand the people layer and then expand the transform option, we can see that the position and opacity is animated exactly like the wayfinding elements. So let's drag the time indicator and see how it is. It's pretty good. And then we can collapse this layer and move on to the light and color finishes. And for this layer, the first thing I want to do is to change the blending mode. And we can change it here under the mode column. And if you don't see it, there's a few icons at the bottom of this panel. And you might need to just expand or collapse those options. So we would want to change this to multiply, or whichever you think that works the best for you. And for this layer, I just want to give a very slow fade-in effect by animating the opacity. So like what we did with render base, we'll just click the stopwatch in front of opacity and give it a 0 at the beginning. And this time I will drag the time indicator to 3 seconds and then give it 800 here. So what we can see is that there is a slow animation of adding hue and light and color finishes to the composition. So now what I would like to do is to add some text as each layer shows up, and I'll take the wayfinding elements layer as an example. So let's click the text tool icon here and click anywhere in the composition. And after we're done with typing, we just click anywhere inside the timeline to exit the type tool. And then we can see that on the right side, there's the property panel for the character, and you can change the font and size and everything. For this time, I actually want to give this text a background, so it's a boxed text style. And this is basically a preset, so let's have this layer selected and then go to Effects, Blur, and then choose Fast Box Blur, and then Effects again. Let's go to Color Correction and choose Curves, and then Effects again. Let's go to Generate this time and choose Fill, and the last effect is under Channel, CC Composite. So what do all those effects do. The first thing we can change is the blur radius. We realize that it's just changing how far this blur goes. And then we would want to change the channel under curves to alpha instead of RGB, and then drag the lower left corner all the way to the top. And then we can see that there is a box behind the text now, and the blur radius is how big this box is. And the fill would be just the color of the box. So in this case, I want to give it a green color. Okay, and then we can move this text to where we want it to show up by selecting the layer in the layers panel, and then drag it to place it where we would like it to be. And how I want to animate it is that I want it to show up as if it's showing up behind an invisible box. So let's make that box first. We need to make sure that none of the layers are selected, and then choose the rectangle tool. And let's draw the rectangle that this text is going to hide behind. And then you can see in the timeline, a new layer, a shape layer, is created automatically. And then there is the options to change the fill and stroke. Actually, in this case, we will need the fill to be any color, but it needs to have a fill. And then we'll go to the wayfinding element layer, and then change the track matte option to alpha inverted matte. So you can see that the shape layer is automatically hidden. And now if we move the text, it actually would hide behind this box. We need to decide where this wayfinding element's text and the shape layer is going to show up. So it should show up when the wayfinding element layer shows up. And then it should probably end a second before the next layer show up. So this is pretty good. We can drag the time indicator just to see whether they show up at the same time. This is great. And then we just need to animate the position of the text. We'll expand this layer and then transform. And then since we have the text at its final position right now, so we will animate backwards. So a few frames in, I'll click the stopwatch icon in front of position, and then I'll go back to the beginning of this layer and then change the z-axis of the position so that it hides behind this rectangle. Okay, that is perfect. And then we'll do the same so that it disappears at the end of this layer. So to do that, we need to decide when we want this text to start to disappear. So I think this is a good spot. And then we'll click this diamond shape icon in front of the position options. So this would add a keyframe at the current time, but it will have the same settings. So we'll click that and then we place a keyframe here. And then we'll move to the end of this clip. And then we will copy the first keyframe. Then we can collapse this layer and see how it looks. And the last thing I want to do is to have a text showing up at the very end of this video. So when the lighting effect slowly shows up, I want the white text to show up and stay there until the end of the animation. So we will use the type tool again. And then also we want to have a leader line pointing to where those elements are. And to do that, we need to deselect from the current layer, and then use the pen tool draw a line. And when this happens, it's probably because your cap lock is on. So this line looks pretty good. Let's just use the selection tool to move the text to where it should be. Okay, I think this is pretty good for its final position. And now let's just change when these two elements are going to show up. So it should show up a little bit a second after the lighting effect starts to kick in. So I'll first animate this leader line by going to Contents, and then there's an icon Add. If we click this icon, there's different options, and what we want to animate is trim paths. So let's click that. And if we expand trim paths, we can animate the start and the end of this line. And at the beginning, let's move the time indicator to the beginning. And we will animate the end of this line by clicking the stopwatch. And here, let's do 0%, and then a few keyframes in. Let's do a 100%. And let's just see how that plays out. That's pretty good. So let's animate the text. This time, I also want to use a preset. So let's move the time indicator to where we want the animation to start and go to Effects and Presets. You can see there's so many different presets here. What we're going to use is animation presets, and there's text, 3D text, and we're going to use the 3D rotate in by capture. So let's drag and drop this preset onto the text layer. And I want this animation to start and end at the same time as the line animation. So we're going to expand this layer and go to the animation until we can find the diamond key. Okay, so the keyframe is here, and then let's move the time indicator to this keyframe and drag the keyframe, the end keyframe of the text animation over by holding the shift key so that it snaps onto the time indicator. And then we can collapse everything and see how that works out. This animation is pretty much done. However, if you want to change the time of this composition, we can go to the composition and then composition settings, and here we can change the duration of the composition. But I'm not going to change it now. I think for this animation, 15 seconds is fine. Last thing we need to do is to export this animation, and I would recommend to use Media Encoder, and that would be under Composition, and then add to Adobe Media Encoder queue. And then Media Encoder would open in a different window, and that composition would be automatically added to the queue here. And then we can click on the preset and change the output settings if you wish, or just choose a clip of the animation to export. But this time everything is fine. I'm not going to change anything, and then I would recommend to export H.264 format. It's just an .mp4 format, which is pretty small. I'll just hit OK, and then click the green arrow to start render. So it took a while to render, but here it is.